So over the next series of videos, we're going to be looking at buttonholes. So depending on which machine you have, you may have a 4-step buttonhole function or a 1-step buttonhole function, and I'm going to teach you how to do both. I'm also going to teach you about the feet, how to measure the buttons, how to place them on your garments correctly, and how to even sew a button on using your sewing machine. So we're going to need to identify whether you've got a 4-step or a 1-step buttonhole function on your sewing machine. And one of the ways you can do that is by looking at the buttonhole foot that's come with your accessory pack. Now, if you've got a foot that looks like this, with little markers up the side and with the centre bit that moves up and down, then the chances are you've got a 4-way buttonhole function. If your buttonhole foot looks like this, and it opens up at the back of the foot to put a button in, then you're probably working with a 1-step buttonhole function. Now, some machines, some of the older machines, you would use a darning foot to do your buttonholes, and to be honest, they probably work in a very similar manner to the 4-way. So continue watching if you do have an older machine, and see if this will help you. The other way you can tell whether you've got a 4-step or 1-step buttonhole function is by looking at the stitch library. If you've got a 4-step buttonhole function, you've got stitches that look quite similar to this. So you've got a line of stitches that go up, it zigzags across the top, it zigzags down, and it again does the zigzagging at the bottom to cap off your buttonhole. So that's a 4-step method. On 1-step buttonhole machines, you will tend to find that you just got an image of a buttonhole on it. So we're going to have a little look at how you place your buttons and how you mark them onto the fabric. Now, if you're working from a pattern, you will have got in your pattern instructions somewhere some sort of buttonhole guide. So I've got 2 examples here. One's from a print off digital pattern, and this has come from a standard commercial pattern. And here you can see this sort of straight line with 2 little lines at the top of the bottom. Looks a little bit like a capital I, and this is indicating where your buttons should be placed. Now, one thing actually I will note about these buttonhole guides is that they are to be cut out to the suitable size that you're making, but you don't cut any additional fabric. The fabric is incorporated, or the placket is already incorporated into the garment or is on a different piece of fabric. This is simply just a guide, so don't waste any fabric by cutting this out on it. I'm going to use this shirt as an example. So this hasn't got any buttons on at the moment, and I've got a placket that has 7 buttonholes on it, and these are evenly spaced between each other. Now, there's a couple of things I need to factor into it. Number 1, which side of the shirt do I want to have the buttonholes on? Now, if you are making a men's shirt, and this is just traditionally, if you're making a men's shirt, you would have the buttonholes on the right-hand side because you button it right over left. With women's, it's left over right. And actually, the history of that is because traditionally women were dressed by servants, and so therefore they had them done up on the opposite sides, and men were able to dress themselves, so they didn't need it. So we're going to do this as a men's shirt. So that's the first thing we're going to consider. Right, so the second thing we need to consider is the direction in which your machine sews the button. So particularly on 4-step buttonhole machines, you may find that the buttonhole starts at the bottom and works its way up, but you also might find that it starts at the top and works its way down. So we will look at that when we look at 4-step buttonhole functions. We will look at identifying whether it comes from the top down or from the bottom upwards. And the final thing we need to consider is whether the bit that you're placing buttonholes onto has seam allowance that is already sewn or not, or whether your pattern has incorporated it. So for example, in front of me, I've got a buttonhole guide that if I were to line that up with that center front line, you'll see that actually the main garment has got a seam allowance that hasn't been closed off yet. So if you were placing this, you wouldn't want to place it right up against the edge because there's a seam allowance there. Now, I suspect when it comes to construction, that bit would already be sewn, so you're not to worry about it. But on the odd occasion where it hasn't been sewn, you do need to take that into consideration. But this example here in front of me, it's very clear that the placket has been sewn together and is just awaiting these marks to go on. So we're now going to look at marking these buttonholes onto the placket. Now, you can tailor tack these different points, but it depends on the accuracy of your tailor tacking as to whether they remain straight and evenly distributed. So I personally prefer to use a friction marker, although you do have to be careful because these will potentially stain the fabric. So depending on what fabric you're using, you might want to consider using a chalk or some sort of fabric marker. Now, the first thing I do is I place the placket guide or the buttonhole guide over the placket, okay, to get sort of an understanding of how wide it is, where the centre line is, and what we're looking for. And in this instance, these buttonholes are going up vertically, so you'll be sewing them and they'll be stitched in vertically. You do get horizontal lines as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take the buttonhole guide to put to one side, and I am going to find the center of my placket. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to just draw a line down this. Right, and the reason why I've done that is because I'm now going to place each of the individual buttonholes that I need to sew against that line. Now I know that because this is even all the way down, this is going to give me a really beautiful finish. Right, so that line has been drawn down the center of the placket and I'm now able to start work on this. Now, when you are marking in the top and the bottoms of your buttonholes, you can absolutely put in both the markers, but to be honest, you only need to put in one of them, and which one you choose depends on how your machine sews. So if you've got a machine that sews from the bottom upwards on your buttonhole, so it starts at the bottom and works its way up, you will need to mark the bottom line. If yours starts from the top and works downwards, you will need to mark the top line. Okay, so you don't need to mark both. And the reason why I'm reluctant to do both is because depending on the size of your button, providing you start at the same point on each buttonhole, you will have a consistent finish every time, regardless of the size it needs to be. So that's why I'm always reticent to do the top and bottom markings. So what we need to do is we need to take our buttonhole guide. So this is a top and that sits here, and this goes down to the hemline down there, so that's good. And I am going to fold this in half along the vertical line of the buttonhole. Okay, so this will typically you'll only be able to do this typically if your buttons are on the vertical line. So I've now done that, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to place this guide up against that line, okay, and I'm going to pin it into position. So you can pin it a couple of times, but I think just two or three pins are sufficient. If you want to pin it every hole to make sure nothing slips, that's also fine. Okay, So with this in place now, so I'm marking the bottom bits, and the reason why is because my machine sews from the bottom upwards. So I'm just going to finish these off. Excellent. And now I can take off the buttonhole guide, and I'm going to mark this across to the other side. So this is now marked up and ready to be sewn. In this example, the buttons are actually placed horizontally. So I just wanted to show you how you would go about marking those in, because it's almost exactly the same. So what you will notice about this placket here and the guide here is that you've got a centre front line, and generally speaking you will find that on a lot of garments, unless there is a specific placket piece that is designed for the garment. But this is obviously the centre front, because you have to have an overlap for the buttons to go. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this pattern piece over. I'm going to place a little pin in it. Okay, so I put a couple of pins in there just to keep it nice and secure, so I know that's the centre front line. Now what you could do in this instance is you can draw the centre front line in with a pen, but it's probably a bit unnecessary, because what you can do is take your buttonhole guide, and you, instead of folding it down that centre line, you'll fold it along the bottom edges. Again, if you're working from the top down, if your sewing machine works from top down, you'll fold at the top of the buttonholes. So if I fold that over at the bottom of the buttonholes, what I can see is where that centre line is, and where those buttons need to be placed. So I'm going to again just pin that on just to keep it nice and secure. And I'm going to mark the bottom line on the garment, and I'm also going to mark the centre line as well. And it's really important to mark up the buttonhole and either the bottom or the top, because those markings you're going to need when you hit the machine. So the last thing I want to talk about is the importance of interfacing and buttonholes. Now interfacing, if you don't know, is a type of fabric stiffener, and it is normally woven fabric or felted fabric, which makes it non-stretch. You can get fusible and non-fusible. So with fusible interfacing, which is most common in dressmaking, you end up with a gluey side, which gets pressed onto the fabric and keeps everything nice and secure. Now, if you're working on buttonholes, buttonholes require an intense amount of stitching in a very small area. So the fabric gets quite damaged underneath. So if it's not stabilised, it's prone to breaking, it's prone to becoming wonky, and you just end up with very unneat buttonholes. So always my advice is to put interfacing underneath any placket or any buttonhole that you want to put on your garment, whether it's a drawstring or whether it's a full-blown shirt placket. Please use interfacing. You can get stretched interfacing for stretchier fabrics, which does a really lovely job in keeping things nice and stable. But even if it's lightweight, it will give the fabric a lot more structure to work with.